There is a specific kind of loss that doesn't feel like loss while it's happening, not the loss of something you valued and then watched disappear. The other kind, the kind where the thing was so gradual in its going, so quiet in the way it reduced itself, and then reduced itself again, that by the time it was fully gone, the space it left had already been filled by other things, useful things, efficient things, things that asked less of you and delivered more reliably. And one day someone asks, a partner, a doctor filling out a form, a friend who says something offhand, and you reach for what used to be there and find the reaching itself has gotten unfamiliar. That is what is happening with desire. Not to everyone, not uniformly, not in ways that are simple to map, but consistently enough, across enough different countries and demographics and life circumstances, that researchers studying sexual health have spent the better part of 2 decades trying to explain a pattern that the people living inside it rarely think to report. Adults in their 20s and 30s, the demographic that biological logic would place at peak interest, are having less sex, reporting less desire, and, most significantly, experiencing the absence with less distress than any previous generation would have predicted. The numbers exist. Studies tracking American adults between 18 and 29 across 3 decades found significant declines in reported sexual frequency, most pronounced among the youngest cohort. Japan named the phenomenon herbivore men, young males who had simply stopped pursuing sexual relationships, not out of philosophical conviction but out of something closer to diffuse indifference. The UK's National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles documented frequency declines across nearly all age groups between 2001 and 2012. The pandemic pushed the curves further in a direction whose full effects are still being mapped. But the numbers are not the most interesting thing here. The most interesting thing is what people say and don't say when they try to describe the experience from inside it. They don't, for the most part, describe grief. They don't describe frustration. They describe something more neutral than either of those. A kind of functional adequacy. Life is busy, the demands are real, the tiredness is genuine, and desire keeps getting deferred, not canceled, just deferred, until the difference between deferring and canceling stops being perceptible. That absence of distress is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is the thing that distinguishes this from a crisis in the conventional sense. A crisis mobilizes. A crisis has a shape that can be addressed. What is being described here is something more like the opposite of a crisis, a comfortable, slightly muffled state that doesn't hurt enough to investigate, that coexists peacefully with the rest of life, that looks from the outside exactly like a person who is fine. And here is where I want to push on something that most conversations about declining desire skip past too quickly, because it is uncomfortable in a different way from the discomfort of not having desire. The question is not just why desire is going. The question is what desire was doing while it was there, what it was for beyond the obvious, beyond the biological, beyond the relational. Because if desire is only a drive toward a specific activity, then its decline is a clinical matter, a question of hormones and stress and environmental factors that can be measured and potentially corrected. But if desire is something else, something more like an orientation, a form of aliveness, a way of being directed toward the world that is not reducible to any single object, then its disappearance means something different, something that a list of contributing factors does not fully capture. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote, in a context entirely removed from sexuality, that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. She meant the capacity to be genuinely present to something outside yourself, to let it matter, to let it have weight, to resist the habit of processing experience into usefulness before it has had time to simply be experienced. Desire, in the broadest sense, requires exactly that quality. It requires the willingness to be affected, to want something that has not yet been obtained, to sit in the tension between wanting and having, to find that tension generative rather than intolerable. A culture that is very good at eliminating tension, that has built entire industries around the conversion of wanting into having with minimum friction, minimum waiting, minimum exposure to the discomfort of not yet, is not a culture that is good at desire. It is a culture that is good at consumption, and those are not the same thing, even when the object being consumed is pleasure. The brain's reward system releases dopamine in anticipation of reward, not in the receiving of it, but in the wanting. This is not a metaphor. It is the mechanism. The neurological substrate of desire is not satisfaction. It is the gap between the present state and the imagined future state, and the drive to close that gap, remove the gap, make satisfaction immediate, frictionless, perpetually available, and you do not produce a more satisfied person. You produce a person whose reward system has lost its primary function, which is to motivate movement towards something not yet possessed. Every time a screen delivers a small, reliable hit of novelty, a new message, a refreshed feed, a cued episode, a notification that something has changed since the last time you checked, it is doing something to that mechanism, not dramatically, not irreversibly in any single instance, but cumulatively, in the way that a river changes course not through any single flood, but through the patient, daily work of water finding the path of least resistance. The system recalibrates towards smaller, faster, more controllable rewards. And desire, which is slow, which is unpredictable, which requires the presence of another person who is not a content feed and cannot be curated, begins to feel like an inefficient way to get something that other things provide more reliably. This is what researchers call hedonic adaptation, the nervous system's tendency to reduce its response to repeated stimuli, the same mechanism that makes you stop hearing the refrigerator after an hour in the same room. The stimulus doesn't change, the sensitivity changes, and the recalibration, crucially, is asymmetric. The system deadens downward faster than it recovers upward. Sensitivity, once lost, takes longer to return than it took to lose, which means that the person who has spent years in a high-stimulation environment and then wonders why ordinary experience feels flat is not imagining the flatness. The flatness is real. It was produced. But I want to resist the version of this argument that stops at neuroscience, because stopping at neuroscience produces a conclusion that is technically accurate and humanly incomplete. The conclusion would be, the brain adapted to its environment. The environment changed the brain's reward calibration. The result is reduced desire. True. And also insufficient, because it treats the person as a passive receiver of environmental effects, rather than as someone who has, gradually, and mostly without noticing, made a series of choices about what kind of experience to prioritize. The choices are small. That is how they work. You pick up the phone because you have 30 seconds. You watch one more episode because stopping requires a decision, and continuing requires nothing. You choose the option that asks less of you, not because you are lazy, but because you are tired, and tired people conserve energy, and the optimization of conservation is rational in the short term, and costly over long enough time horizons. No single choice produces the recalibration. The accumulation does. Canadian psychologist Rosemary Basson's research on what she called responsive desire, published in the early 2000s as an alternative to the classical linear model of desire that assumed drive precedes contact, is useful here, though not quite in the way it is usually invoked. Basson described a pattern, more common in women but not exclusive to them, in which desire does not arise spontaneously in the absence of stimulus, but emerges in response to context, to proximity, to safety, to the relational conditions that allow the body to lower its guard. The desire is real. It simply does not announce itself in advance. It arrives when the conditions are right. What this means in the current environment is more specific than it is usually taken to be. If desire is responsive, if it depends on context rather than arising independently of it, then a context that is perpetually fragmented, perpetually distracted, perpetually managing the next demand, is a context in which responsive desire simply does not get the conditions it requires to appear, not because the person has lost the capacity, because the capacity requires conditions that are not being provided. The desire is not absent. It is waiting for something that is not arriving. For people whose desire functions more spontaneously, the pattern more common in men, though again not exclusive, the equivalent failure mode is different in mechanism, but similar in result. The pressure of performance, the anxiety of not matching an implicit image of sexual capability that nobody explicitly requested, but that is present everywhere as ambient standard, can produce an avoidance that sediments over time into what looks from the outside exactly like absence of interest. It is not absence of interest. It is interest that has learned to preemptively protect itself from the possibility of failure. The difference between those two things is significant and almost impossible to see from inside the experience. What both patterns have in common, the responsive desire that has stopped finding its conditions, and the spontaneous desire that has retreated behind anticipatory avoidance is that neither of them is accurately described as the person not wanting. Both of them are the person wanting in a way that the current conditions do not know how to receive. And then there is the layer that is hardest to name because it requires saying something that sounds almost too simple. People are touching each other less, not in the sexual sense specifically, but in the basic sense of physical contact that is not charged with expectation, that is not the precursor to something else, that exists as its own complete thing. The hug that is not a greeting, the hand that rests on an arm without agenda, the presence of another body in the same space, doing nothing in particular, generating the specific kind of nervous system regulation that no screen can replicate because no screen has a nervous system, and regulation is a two-body process. Skin has memory. The nervous system responds to physical proximity in ways that are older than language, older than culture, older than the part of the brain that knows what it wants and why. When that baseline contact diminishes, when the texture of daily life becomes increasingly mediated, increasingly virtual, increasingly organized around the exchange of information rather than the sharing of physical space, the body loses a form of calibration that is also a form of appetite. Not desire in the explicit sense, the precondition of desire, the ground it grows in. When the ground is gone, desire does not struggle. It simply has nowhere to take root. There is a study that keeps staying with me. Researchers at the University of Toronto, publishing in 2016, asked people with low desire to identify what they experienced as the primary contributing factor. The most common answer was not stress, not relationship difficulty, not hormonal imbalance. It was fatigue, but a specific kind, described consistently as the fatigue of existing in a state of constant demand, without sufficient pause for the organism to recover. Not the tiredness that one night of sleep addresses, the other kind, the kind that is still there in the morning. What draws me to that finding is not the fatigue itself. It is what the fatigue had already done before the people reached the point of being able to name it. It arrived in layers. First, it took the willingness to initiate, then the willingness to respond, then the capacity to imagine, anticipatory desire, the wanting that happens before any contact is made, the mental rehearsal of possibility that is, neurologically, where desire actually lives. And by the time many of them arrived at a clinical setting or a research survey, what remained was the memory that something used to be there, without clear recollection of the precise moment it left. This matters because it reframes the question. Most interventions for low desire begin at the symptom. Techniques, medications, behavioral adjustments designed to restore what has been lost. Sometimes they work, but when the fatigue is chronic and structural, when the environment that produced it remains unchanged, the restored desire is fragile. Not because the person doesn't want to want, because wanting is a state that requires conditions, not only intention. You cannot will yourself into desire any more than you can will yourself into hunger after years of eating past the point of appetite. The mechanism requires rehabilitation, not instruction. And here is the tension that I find most difficult to hold without resolving too quickly. The decline of desire is simultaneously a structural problem and a personal one. Structural, because the conditions that produce it, the chronic demand, the superstimulation, the erosion of physical contact, the acceleration of everything, are not individual failures. They are features of the environment that most people in contemporary developed societies inhabit. No individual chose this environment wholesale. It assembled itself from 10,000 small choices that each made sense in isolation and produced something at scale that nobody designed and nobody quite authorized. Personal, because the choices that constitute the environment are still choices. The phone picked up in a moment of boredom. The episode continued past tiredness, the conversation replaced by a scroll. Each one is small. The accumulation is not. The tension between those two things, between the structural and the personal, between the environment that shaped you and the choices you are still making within it, is not resolvable by coming down firmly on one side. The people who collapse entirely into the structural explanation tend to produce a kind of learned helplessness. Nothing I do matters because the conditions are the conditions. The people who collapse entirely into the personal explanation tend to produce a different kind of damage, shame that masquerades as accountability, the conviction that the right technique or the right mindset would restore what is missing, a pathologizing of a normal response to an abnormal environment. What both collapses miss is the philosophical question underneath them, which is the one I think the data has been pointing toward without quite being able to say directly. The question is not what caused desire to decline. The question is what desire was doing while it was present, what function it served that was not only sexual, not only relational, not only biological. René Girard argued that human desire is never fully spontaneous, that it is always mediated, always learned in relation to other desires, always shaped by models that we absorb before we are conscious of absorbing them. The insight is unsettling in the way that true things often are. It means that the desire you feel as most authentically your own is partly the product of the world you were formed inside. Your wants are not independent of your environment. They are, in some significant measure, a record of it. If that is right, and I think it is, not entirely but enough to matter, then the environment that shapes desire now is producing a specific kind of wanting, or a specific kind of not wanting. An orientation toward the world in which the things that are immediately available are sufficient, in which the gap between current state and desired state has been closed not by attaining what was wanted, but by reducing the wanting itself. Efficiency of the deepest kind. Not getting more but needing less. This is not peace. It resembles peace from certain angles, but peace is a fullness. This is a compression. The person who has genuinely found sufficiency and the person whose wanting has been gradually anesthetized can look identical from outside and feel almost identical from inside until something interrupts the anesthesia, until something asks them to want something specific, to reach toward something not yet possessed, to stay in the discomfort of not yet having long enough to find out whether they are still capable of it. Desire is inconvenient. It points at what is missing. It creates a tension that cannot be resolved by opening a different tab. It requires the other, not a representation of the other, not a curated version, but the actual, unedited, unpredictable, occasionally frustrating presence of another human being who does not know exactly what you want because you do not entirely know either. That not knowing is not a defect in the system. It is the system. The imprevisibility of genuine encounter is not an obstacle to desire. It is the condition without which desire has nothing to reach toward. When that condition is systematically replaced by frictionless availability, when everything that used to require search and risk and the specific vulnerability of asking can be obtained without any of those things, desire does not find a better object. It finds no object worth the effort of wanting. The question that stays after all the explanations is not the one most people bring to it. Not what caused this, not how to fix it, not which intervention has the strongest evidence base. The question is smaller and harder and more personal than any of those. What would you have to stop filling the silence with for long enough to find out if desire is still in there, waiting in a room you stopped visiting because you couldn't remember what you went there for?